we've experienced a very full day, and again, if you're like me, you've been picking threads and kind of holding on to those themes that touch your experience, or maybe challenge your experience. And so what I've been asked to do this afternoon is just to reflect on the experience from my own perspective. And so I guess it's also an invitation to you to be doing that yourself, to join into this reflection with me. I've been working on issues connected with human trafficking for almost 15 years now. And I have to say I have as many questions now as I did when I started. If there's any hope or sense of progress, I think the questions are a little bit different now than they were then. But what I want to do for the next little while is just to reflect on some of the questions and the concerns that have been raised for me today. And in particular, I want to highlight those questions and concerns that have been raised by the wonderful talks we've heard today. And I was lucky enough to get abstracts, short abstracts of the talks a little bit earlier, so in some ways I knew what was coming today. So I want to begin with the importance of holding on to some tensions in our life. And one of the tensions that has been identified today as we've listened to the different speakers is that tension between prosecution and protection. And right from the Palermo Protocol, which several of our speakers referred to, we can see that that tension has not been held well. The protocol has some articles that are obligatory and some that are optional. The obligatory articles are all connected with prosecution. The articles that are about protecting human rights are the optional ones. And we can see a similar kind of development in Canada, where our national response to human trafficking has focused primarily on efforts to prosecute traffickers, and only secondarily on the efforts to protect the human rights of people who have been in situations of trafficking. So as Loli Rico mentioned, we have a temporary resident permit for people who have been trafficked, but it's critically flawed. So much so that those who should be accessing this permit often choose not to go that route because they don't feel sufficiently protected by the process. And even though, as several of our speakers have mentioned, a person doesn't have to be cooperating with law enforcement to receive the initial TRP, the temporary resident permit, what we've experienced in our coalitions is that a person is very unlikely to get the TRP extended without that cooperation with law enforcement. So my reflection is this. Ironically, when the emphasis is on prosecution over protection, it actually undermines the prosecution side of the equation, because when people don't feel protected enough to come forward, it's much easier for the traffickers to get away with their crime. Another tension is that between collaboration and what I'm going to call mission. Marty spoke about the appreciation that law enforcement officials have for the work that is done by NGOs and community coalitions. And Robin Pike showed how that collaboration can work well. The reality is that law enforcement relies on the outreach and care that's done by service agencies, the outreach to people who have been in situations of trafficking. And certainly, I think there have been times when coalitions and NGOs have needed the investigative work and the protection of law enforcement as they deal with the risks and the complexities in the lives of people who have been trafficked. So the bottom line is this collaboration is a very good thing. But it seems to me that if our coalitions, NGOs, and service agencies are going to respond in ways that promote the human rights that Annalee and so many of us have been talking about today, we must also maintain a pretty clear awareness of the limits to this collaboration. Let me give you an example. I'm thinking of some migrant workers I met who had been in situations with very strong elements of human trafficking. They came to Canada under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, but the contractor took them to a place of employment that wasn't on their contract, so immediately they were in violation of that contract. That was one of many methods that the contractor used to control them. By the time I met them, they had run away from the contractor and were trying to figure out what to do next. After discussing the pros and cons of various options with them, they decided to go underground to try to find a new job in a new situation. It seems to me that in NGO work, there are times when we need to maintain some distance in our relationship with the police. In my mind, for these workers, deportation would have been a terrible outcome because these were workers who came to Canada and all they wanted was a job with fair pay. I was trying to help these workers, along with some others, find the space and the information that they needed to make their own choice about what was best for their future. In a context that was filled with all kinds of complexity and ambiguity, that seemed like the best way to promote their human rights. For me, it was about remaining faithful to the mission of the organization to which I belong. So while there's much to be gained for trafficked persons when there is collaboration between law enforcement and NGOs or community groups, it seems to me that there are also limits to the collaboration, and indeed there are times when our mandates and our agendas are at cross purposes. And this is just one of the tensions that we need to live with. A third tension is that between outreach and advocacy. The coalition to which I belong is focused on assisting trafficked persons. We have a wide range of services. Service agencies are represented at the table, and when a person has been in a situation with elements of trafficking and comes forward to one of the agencies, it's going to take all of our agencies working together to respond well to this person. As Jackie has explained so well, people in situations of trafficking can have a lot of trauma, and they can be impacted in many different ways. And it works best when each of us can bring our diverse expertise to the table so that we can respond well to these diverse needs. The impacts of trafficking are such that outreach could be all-consuming, but I would offer that we must not let it. As we accompany people who have been trafficked, we learn a great deal about the strengths and the weaknesses of government policies in Canada. I think it's incumbent upon us to inform politicians and to inform policy people about what we've learned. What's more, when we truly grapple with this tension between outreach and advocacy, it leads us to the root causes of human trafficking. Teresa Edwards mentioned some of the root causes when she spoke about the barriers that are faced by Aboriginal women. Root causes draw us into the big social questions: poverty, sexism, racism, militarism, unbridled profit-seeking, to mention just a few. We could spend a week together looking at all of this, and I really think that we should, because these patterns are the patterns that shape our lives. They privilege some of us and they marginalize others. Obviously, there's no time for that today. Instead, I want to just give one example of how that tension between outreach and advocacy can lead us into these bigger questions. I want to go back to the migrant workers that I mentioned earlier, the ones whose stories held elements of trafficking. Based on the encounters with these folks, I realized that I needed to learn a lot more about the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, which I did. It was a real eye-opener, and that's another thing that I can't go into in much detail today. But I want to highlight just one of the problems. Work permits, as I mentioned with these workers, are tied to specific employers. So if there's a problem with the employer, and you're the worker, you're kind of stuck. Because of this, unscrupulous contractors can take full advantage of the weakness in the temporary foreign worker program. They can use that, along with other weaknesses, other vulnerabilities, to create situations of human trafficking. Now, many of our coalitions have talked to people in government about this, and in response to these critiques, government has issued an important information package that outlines the rights of temporary foreign workers. It says, and I'm going to quote here, "All temporary foreign workers are allowed to change employers, and you will not be penalized or deported for looking for another place to work," end quote. And then it goes on to list the steps that you need to go through in order to do that. What it doesn't say is that even if a migrant worker can find another employer who's willing to go through that process to hire them, it can take months for the employer to apply for and receive the labor market opinion, and then for the worker to apply for and receive the amended work permit. And during those months, the migrant worker isn't able to work. I don't know about you, but I haven't met any migrant workers who can survive that long without working. So an information package is not a solution. In fact, I would say that this is a papering over of the problem. And these are the kinds of things that we learn when we accompany people who have been trafficked. And we need to speak out about these things. They're contributing to the creation of an underclass of disposable workers whose labor is exploited. Holding on to this tension between outreach and advocacy is what awakens us to the need for deep change. So those are just 3 tensions. You may have picked up some others that you've been grappling with today. These are tensions that I've learned that I need to hold on to in my own work. Prosecution and protection, collaboration and mission, outreach and advocacy. There are others that I grapple with, but at least this gives you a sense of the challenges. The second theme that I'd like to touch on is exploring blind spots that are created by our labels and categories, and some of our speakers have touched on this. The most obvious blind spot is one that has been mentioned so many times, that commonly held stereotype. The trafficked person, the stereotype of the woman, young woman from a foreign country who's been manipulated, lied to, probably kidnapped, and forced into the sex trade. The stereotype does describe some people who have been trafficked. But I would suggest that it's still a stereotype that needs to be constantly challenged because it prevents us from realizing the many diverse faces of trafficking and the many diverse lines of work into which people have been trafficked. And folks have mentioned those different areas of work: the agricultural sectors, domestic work, factory work. Some of the other stereotypes that we need to hold on to, or that we need to be able to challenge, are stereotypes that get in the way of us grappling with the complexity of human trafficking. One of the comments at the table I was sitting with is, there's nothing black and white here. It's all about shades of gray. So when we want to discover whether someone's been trafficked, it seems to me that the most important thing we can do is to listen to their story and to build a relationship with them. And it's in those stories and in those relationships that we learn to let our own categories get broken open. One short story about breaking open categories, and I was telling someone else this earlier. I was at another workshop where the RCMP officer who was involved in the Opapa case that Marty was talking about, she was talking about her experience there. And one of the things she said was, in the early stages of the investigation, twice she went to the Crown Attorney to talk about the situation and to say, you know, we've got a situation of human trafficking here. And twice the Crown Attorney said to her, that's not human trafficking. Fortunately, the RCMP officer had enough perseverance to stick with it. And obviously it unfolded into a very clear case of human trafficking. Thank goodness that officer continued to pursue that. As service agencies and as NGOs, we need to be prepared to do the same thing. We need to know that exploitation outside the sex trade is often dismissed as bad working conditions. We need to struggle against the current trend in which it seems that for exploitation outside the sex trade, there actually needs to be a larger number of indicators of trafficking for it to be recognized, for decision makers to accept that trafficking may be occurring. The prevailing assumption is that most of the trafficking that goes on in Canada takes place in the sex trade. This is because most of the cases that are recognized and prosecuted take place in the sex trade. And these are the statistics that we rely on. But I would offer that we can't buy into the assumption that the cases that are prosecuted are the only ones that are occurring. I've already talked about foreign nationals who are trafficked for labor exploitation. Our experience is that they're extremely reluctant to come forward to police or to go to immigration. They feared being deported while their families still have large debts to pay. I want to just put this in a global context for a moment. Statistics from the International Labor Organization indicate that globally, 22% of the people who are trafficked for labor exploitation are trafficked into the sex industry. 68% are trafficked into other forms of labor exploitation. 22% sex trade, 68% other forms, 10% state-imposed labor. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that those statistics would hold true for Canada. In fact, even the global statistics, it seems to me, are skewed because of a very high level of trafficking in the Asia-Pacific area. But here's the thing, we're finding people in Canada who have been trafficked into Canada from the Asia-Pacific area. And as the Opapa case shows, it's not just the Asia-Pacific area that we need to be concerned about. They were trafficked from Hungary. So we can't let statistics blind us to the more hidden forms of trafficking. Otherwise, we may end up with the same blinders that seem to have affected the people of California. Last November, the people of California voted to adopt Proposition 35. I took a look at the official voter information guide about Proposition 35. Here's what it says. Proposition 35 will increase prison sentences and fines for human trafficking convictions. It requires convicted human traffickers to register as sex offenders. Do you hear the conflation? And it's not the conflation that we've been talking about all day. It's not the conflation that all prostitution is human trafficking. It's the conflation that all human trafficking happens in the sex trade. So when we're not careful to those blinders that we have on, that's the kind of situation we get in. I mean, really, what would be the point of registering as a sex offender someone who trafficked people into the construction industry? One final comment about blind spots. And I want to talk about blind spots that are created by our labels and categories. And here I want to focus in on the label, the language of victim, that again, we've talked about several times today. And mostly we've been talking about how unhelpful that language can be because of that passive role that it seems to place upon the person. It seems to me that on another level it's a problem because people who get trafficked don't necessarily see themselves as that passive victim. Instead, they may be feeling, as several speakers mentioned, they may be feeling stupid because they were naive, or angry about having been tricked or manipulated. It's another one of those labels that creates blind spots, but in this case, it's actually creating a blind spot for the survivor of human trafficking. At the same time, the language of victim can prevent us from recognizing the person who's been trafficked. Yeah. And the game that it plays on us is so often we're looking for that person who is weak or traumatized. One woman told me that her trafficking experience, I've been leaning on this and we've been moving along. One woman told me that her trafficking experience actually made her strong. We were talking about an upcoming interview with immigration, and she said that she would be okay, and that was a connection she made. Everything that had happened to her had made her strong. So it wasn't what I was expecting to hear, but that was her experience. And now I want to finish up with just some reflections on power and control. And I'm understanding power here as our human capacity to be able to influence people or to be able to shape events. So I'm seeing that it can be a very positive thing. It can be a way of setting a direction for ourselves. And obviously it can be a very negative thing when it deteriorates into patterns of control. My first reflection is that one of the things that makes it a challenge to identify human trafficking is that the methods of control that are used by traffickers are not always obvious. When it's physical violence that's used or threats that are used, it's an easy call. The problem is, and we've had some reference to it today, that there are so many other ways to control a person and that these are not well acknowledged in our policies. Some people are trafficked into Canada because they took a chance on a job, which they did because their families had huge debts. Sometimes the debt is part of the recruitment process itself. In any case, those folks are often controlled by the pressure of alleviating their family's debt. It's not physical control, but it's control all the same, and it's control that's just as real. Or a migrant worker in an irregular situation may, in theory, be able to refuse to work beyond normal working hours. But what if language barriers get in the way? What if doubts about legal status leave them feeling like they have no choice? What if they're afraid that because the controller pushed them into committing a petty crime, that if they don't comply, they'll end up being arrested? Methods of control can be multifaceted and subtle, and this needs to be better recognized by immigration officers who are making decisions about whether or not to grant TRPs. And this takes me to one other reflection on the issue of power. And I want to stick with the immigration officers. Immigration officers have discretionary power when it comes to granting TRPs. And in some ways, this is a good thing because each person's story is unique and we need to hear the story in its totality before a decision can be made. However, it becomes a problem because NGOs and government representatives together have not done the work of finding common ground when it comes to identifying clear indicators of human trafficking. I'm talking about indicators that acknowledge the ways that there can be a convergence of medium-level control factors that create a situation of human trafficking. And there can be indicators connected with the abuse of vulnerabilities that create situations of trafficking. And because this dialogue has not happened well, this dialogue between NGOs who are accompanying survivors of trafficking and people who are making the policies. Because that dialogue has not happened well, we can end up in a situation where the discretionary power of the CIC officer is actually disempowering the survivor of human trafficking and the NGO rep who may be accompanying them. The thing is that it's just too hard to know whether the TRP will be granted and on what grounds it will be granted. Okay? And so NGOs are always left in that experience of having to tell the person, well, you've got a good case here, but I don't know if it will be accepted. Okay? A very disempowering situation. Too much is left up to the discretionary power of the CIC officer. I want to contrast this with something that's happening in Europe. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has adopted Delphi indicators, which acknowledge how a convergence of medium control factors can create a situation of human trafficking, as well as acknowledging how taking advantage of a vulnerable position that a person might be in can create a situation of trafficking. In Canada, I strongly believe that we need this more nuanced understanding of human trafficking, and it would greatly enhance our protection of people who have been in situations of trafficking. Finally, I want to talk about the power of narrative and the need to take narratives with a grain of salt. And my example goes back to last December. Last December, there was a headline that shouted out that an Ontario-based human smuggling operation had been busted, and 30 people had been detained, and police were looking for 35 more. Do you remember that story? Here's the thing. I happened to be sitting at my computer that day, and in the corner I had the CBC News scrolling along. And when the story first came out, the headline was that a human trafficking ring had been busted. And then a few hours later, the headline changed, and it was a human smuggling ring. And let me give you just a few clips of the actual news article. Quote, "The smugglers would offer to get people into Canada, promising them good jobs, according to a government source. But once they arrive, they find they owe large debts to smugglers, and some allegedly turn to thievery." Well, now I'd be the first person to say that I don't know enough detail about these stories to know if it was human trafficking or smuggling. I just don't know. But here are some of the questions that were raised for me. How large were the debts that were owed? Were the people forced into committing acts of theft as a way to pay off the debts? Because if the debts were overwhelming and they were pushed into stealing, then this could well have been a case of human trafficking. But I can't help but wonder if the indicators of trafficking were even seriously explored in this particular case. Because here's something else that the story mentioned. Sources tell CBC News that many or most of the detainees are Roma, an ethnic group whose refugee claims have spiked in recent years. And a little later, the article says, Minister Kenney has frequently cited Roma as an example of bogus refugee claimants. Again, I don't know the details, but I can't help but question the narrative about smuggling instead of human trafficking because, for me, it doesn't pass the smell test. I can't help but wonder if bias against Roma prevented a serious look at whether this was human trafficking or not. And I can't help but think that we NGOs and social agencies and coalitions need to be much better at networking quickly to find out information about such incidents. So it's been a long day, and I'm going to come to a close here. From my perspective, these are just some of the challenges that we face. And given these challenges, it seems to me that it's wonderful to have so many of us here learning together, and it's wonderful to bring people from so many different sectors. So we need to be taking the time to talk together and to work together, and I thank the Learning Network for bringing us together.